we are in serious trouble. So I can't rely on our elected leaders or our business leaders to solve this. I have to rely on us. And I'm very, very tired of the expression, when are they going to do something about it? Because it's no longer right. It's what are we going to do about it? And I want to replace the they with us and we rather than them.
Hi everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched any of our content so far and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Travers OBE. Will is a writer, broadcaster, and animal activist. He's the president of the Born Free Foundation that he co-founded the charity in 1984. He's a co-founder of Born Free USA and the president of Species Survival Network. Will is the eldest son of acting couple and wildlife campaigners Travers MBE, which sadly passed away in 1994, and Virginia McKenna OBE. Will, welcome to the show.
Well, very nice to see you, Petrus.
So as we mentioned briefly in the intro, your family has a long history of being involved with wildlife conservation and animal rights activists. And, just looking simply at the Wikipedia page alone is, very, very impressive. But for those that don't know, could you give us just the briefest history about what your parents did and, of course, the movie Born Free, which propelled this into fame?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, I was a very young child in 1964 when we as a family went to Kenya to make the film Born Free. My mum and dad were cast in the roles of George and Joy Adamson, the conservationists who famously had reared an orphan lion cub, Elsa, and returned her to the wild. And in those days, you have to recall, there was no such thing as computer-generated graphics, no CGI. There were no doubles used in the film. So it really was, what you see in that film is truly what you get. And it took 10 months to make the film. Nowadays, you would never be able to afford to make a film that takes 10 months to make on location. But I think they did a good job because although, of course, it is slightly polished around the edges, nevertheless, it does tell a real story, a real love story between these two human beings and their battle to return a lion to the wild, which everyone said would be impossible. It was inspired by Joy Adamson's book of the same name, Born Free, and she got much of her source material from George's diaries, which he scrupulously kept. There sort of hasn't been anything quite like it since. And because we spent so much time there, as I say, I was just a tiny child, I was 5. Nevertheless, my mother and father got to know the Adamsons, particularly George Adamson, really well. He was the technical advisor on the film, so he was there every single day. And they got to understand his perspective and Joy's perspective, that animals are individuals. And this was an individual lion with individual likes and dislikes. And that was the story that they were trying to tell. Now, there were quite a number of lions used in the film, around 20. In different age cohorts, because obviously the story tells Elsa's story from being a cub right through to being a mature female and having her own cubs. And to do that in 10 months, there needed to be more than one lioness. Also, some of these leading lionesses had likes and dislikes. So one would be very comfortable sitting on top of the Land Rover and driving along, and another would be comfortable swimming, but then the other one wouldn't. And one would be happy to climb trees and do that part of the storytelling. So there were about 4 adult females, all of whom, for the purposes of the film, are called Elsa, but 4 different lionesses that played her role. And after filming was over, many of those lions, very sadly, and unknown to George, Joy, and my mum and dad, deals have been done, and many of those animals went to zoos and safari parks. But 3 of them, girl and boy and a male called Ugus, were actually retrieved, and George had them, and George successfully returned those 3 to the wild. So the story of rewilding lions continued after Elsa.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful message because I mean, you said that the lions are individuals in themselves. So of course, the different actors you had, because those lions were actors, the professional actors during that time, they had their own personalities, their own likes and dislikes, the things they wanted to do and things they didn't. And this was one of the wonderful, inspiring bits, or rather, thought-provoking bits that when we had a discussion with John Rendell, he said that when George visited them in London and he met Christian the lion, he was so surprised at how calm he was because there was a lot of incidents and a lot of different things that you've experienced during the making of Born Free. And I know you were only young, but I mean, it had such a dramatic impact on you that you actually started the Born Free Foundation, the organization thereafter. Just, as an expose in terms of what the organization now does, could you just give us a brief explanation in terms of what that focuses on?
Sure. Well, it really started actually, although the germ of it came from the film Born Free and my parents' experiences making that film, it was actually the death of an elephant that started Born Free. So subsequent to the making of Born Free, the film, my folks started to make wildlife-related films, sometimes fictional, sometimes non-fiction. And one of them was a family film called An Elephant Called Slowly. It was filmed again in Kenya, and it basically told the story of two people who fly out from the UK to look after somebody's house while they're, I think, in South Africa having an operation. And the note cryptically on the door says, "Look out for the characters." And they couldn't work out what it was until they find that the house is also frequented by three elephants, including a small elephant, a little calf, 2 years old. Now, that little calf, in reality, had been caught by the government of Kenya of the day as a gift for the London Zoo, and she was in the trapper's yard. And through one method or another, my parents managed to borrow her for the 6, 7 weeks of shooting. And after shooting was over, and she was apparently completely delightful, having been terrified, and within 2 days was, eating out of their hands. After filming was over, they said, could we have her, and we'll release her back into the wild with the help of David Sheldrick and the famous Daphne Sheldrick, the late Dame Daphne Sheldrick, world famous for her work on elephants. And the government said, yes, you can, but we will go and catch another baby elephant because we've promised one to the London Zoo. So rather than allow another family to be torn apart and to have a baby taken away, I think they all thought it was better to leave the situation as it was. Roll forward about 12 years, 13 years, and there is this elephant. Her name is Poli Poli, which means slowly in Swahili. She's in the London Zoo. She's on her own. She's showing stereotypic behavior, the swaying behavior that many animals in captivity start to develop because of the stress and the barren nature of their environment. And it was really hard to take. And so Mum and Dad said, look, can we take her back to Africa? And the zoo said no. But they did eventually agree that she could be moved from the London Zoo, where she was on her own, to the Country Park Zoo, which is part of the Zoological Society of London, called Whipsnade, where at least there were other elephants. The move was not a success. In fact, she didn't even leave the compound in London. She actually collapsed in her traveling crate and she had to be jacked to her feet. She damaged a leg, and after a week of hobbling around, they gave her a general anesthetic to check it out, and their words were she lost the will to live, and they euthanized her inside the elephant house. And it made headline news. This is the last African elephant at the London Zoo, very famous zoo. And people were just asking kind of one question: what is going on in our zoos that a teenager, she was 17, a female elephant, is on her own when we know that that's not right, and she should be part of a matriarchal unit, and that she is destroyed at the age of 17. And so we initially started an organization called Zoo Check, and there were 6 of us, and we had $10 to start it with. And we just took the view that if nobody was interested in this issue, we would last, we'd be a 9-day wonder. In fact, we were described as a 9-day wonder by the then director of the London Zoo, and that was 37 years ago. And we've morphed into the Born Free Foundation because, going to the heart of your question, we look at the captivity issue still very closely. So that's circuses with wild animals, zoos, exotic animals as pets. We look at conservation issues, and we call it compassionate conservation because we keep the individual animal as a central part of our conservation ethos. We do education, both here and in parts of Africa and India. And we also look at policy issues. So we look at things that we may come on to explore in this interview, such as the canned hunting of lions in South Africa, for example.
And we'll actually briefly talk about that. There's a fantastic animation on the Born Free Foundation YouTube channel, which exemplifies this. And we'll talk about that soon. I just really want to backtrack just one step again. And talk about, obviously we had the wonderful discussion with John Rendell about Christian the Lion, and his first couple of years in captivity in London weren't necessarily negative, in the sense that he's quite a social animal. They live in prides, so they cared quite well for him. He was quite happy. And we see this type of example, especially in South Africa, because we are, so close to our wildlife here, of other cubs being rescued at one point, say the parents died or they abandoned, and then they were taken to a home. And then after a point when they're, too old or too big for the household that they stay in, they're then released to the wild. What type of wildlife is kept in this scenario that is actually appropriate, at least for the early stages? Or is there absolutely no sense in which these animals can be held? Because we see a lot of these examples, right? I mean, we see tigers and leopards in Sahudian Arabian families. Is there even a justification for this?
Well, I would challenge the notion that those cubs, those lion cubs that you've just mentioned, when they get a little bit too big, and too big is a subjective thing, but I would say that, past 6 months, you're dealing with an animal that can do an incredible amount of damage if something goes wrong. I don't think any of them are returned to the wild. I mean any of them. The learned process. And I know this only because of the work of George Adamson. For so many years after Born Free, right up until his murder in 1989, he and his protege, Tony Fitzjohn, were returning lions to the wild. And it's a multi-year process. It requires 24/7 dedication. And I have not got really any recollection of lion cubs going back to the wild. It's possible that there might be one or two. I mean, literally a handful. But the vast majority of those rescued cubs, if they are indeed rescued or they may have come from breeding facilities, whatever, they're not going back to the wild. They're staying in captivity for the rest of their lives. And then, of course, it does open up that question as to and what is life for those animals like. When John and Ace bought Christian from Harrods Pet Department and kept him as well as they possibly could in their furniture shop in the King's Road in London, and took him to the graveyard, the church graveyard, for exercise, which is all in a film that my dad made, The Lion at World's End, Christian the Lion at World's End. He then came, aged about 9 months, down to where I'm now in the country outside of London. And he stayed here for 3 or 4 months while negotiations went on to take him back to Kenya, and then for him to be returned to the wild by George Adamson. He was a 4th generation zoo lion. His parents came from Ilfracombe Zoo in the United Kingdom. Butch from Holland and Mary from Israel were his parents, as far as I recall. And, George took the best part of 2.5 years for Christian to go fully wild and fully able to look after himself in the wild, to defend a territory, to find mates, to see off challenges. That this is not what people sign up for. And those cute pictures, and I have to say I'm really opposed to it. And I don't think there is a list. In fact, we've just been looking in the UK at exotic animals kept by members of the public as pets. And it runs into some thousands of individual animals. And we don't think that a normal, ordinary member of the public has the requisite skills to provide the complex and sometimes very challenging quality of life requirements for these animals. And absolutely none of them are going back to the wild. To the best of my recollection, for example, you mentioned tigers. The only person I can think of that successfully half returned a tiger to the wild was Billy Arjun Singh in northern India. And there's been some talk about tigers in Siberia being returned to the wild, but when they were recovered as abandoned cubs, they were kept in a semi-wild state as far as possible, so that the jump between captivity, they didn't live in someone's house. They were not pets. They were kept wild so that they stood a chance, at least, of being successfully returned to the wild when they reached the right age.
Yeah, this is fascinating because, I mean, this changes my perspective entirely. I was under the impression that a lot of these rescue organizations that rescue wild animals, especially the big ones, the big cats and so on and so forth, actually do go through the process. But as you said, and I mean, as we chatted about, it really is a long process. So even that process alone doesn't constitute this being a mass, I failed to find the correct words, but say a mass-produced process where you kind of get lions back into the wild. It's not conducive to that.
Well, there's a number of factors, Petrus, that need to be taken into consideration here. Obviously, there's the animal itself. We have a sanctuary at Shamwari in the Eastern Cape where we look after rescued big cats, only big cats, leopard and lion. We have another rescue center in Ethiopia, which has lions and cheetah and hyenas and other species. We know that none of those can go back to the wild. Not only from the animal's perspective, will the animal survive, but also the risk that then poses to the public, to people in communities that may live near where you're trying to do this, and finding a remote part of Africa, so remote that there really aren't people or livestock within, say, 50 miles in any direction, that isn't already occupied by lions that will kill an intruder. If it's got livestock and people, you're running a massive risk because that animal is not afraid of people. That animal is habituated to people, and a terrible accident can happen. And if there are wild lions there, the chances are that this incompetent, and by that I mean an animal that has not learned how to live in the wild by growing up with, in the case of lions, usually with the mother as the lead, is going to be killed by resident lions. So it's probably a death sentence anyway. The lion will either get shot for raiding cattle, shot for attacking a human being, or killed by other lions.
Yeah, this is true. This at least I've heard about from John Rendell's side, where there was a situation with Christian the lion and the local community in which he was released, where there was a confrontation there as well, and that had to be settled between George in that scenario, the locals, and of course making sure that the lion stays away. So there's a different scenario there which I didn't really take into account. And of course there's sorry.
Well, and you've got to remember when that story took place. It was the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, Kenya had a human population of less than 10 million people. Today, Kenya has a human population of over 50 million people. The space, the unoccupied space in which there is almost no human footprint is very, very hard to find.
No, I can completely understand that. And I mean, going back to what we mentioned previously with the animation, I thoroughly recommend anybody that cares at all about wildlife to just go and watch that animation about basically lions being raised to be hunted, and it is quite a heart-wrenching one in the way that it visualizes it. It puts itself forward as a type of relationship that it builds between the caretaker and the lion in a family-friendly environment, and then eventually that lion still just being a product to be hunted afterwards.
Yeah, it's a story of betrayal.
Yes, yeah. I mean, these lions are individuals. They have a personality, they have a care. So there really is an actual genuine feeling of betrayal. There's no primal way around it. So can you give us an idea of how much of this industry makes up the lions in captivity type scenario, and who are these organizations that does this stuff? Is it still illegal, so it's still quite undercover? Could you peel back just the envelope on that a bit?
Sure. So the story that's told in that little animated 2-minute video, and we did it specifically with animation, not with live footage, because we wanted to tell a story in a way that was accessible to people and wasn't gratuitously violent and horrible. it's still shocking. It's still, I've watched that little film, I don't know, 100 times. I don't actually watch it anymore. I watch the people watching it, and I see the change in their reaction. And I'm not going to give away everything in it. But in terms of lions, so the first thing to know is that going back 50 years, when the film Born Free was made, there were probably 200,000 wild lions, between 150 and 200,000 wild lions across Africa. Today there are 20,000, so perhaps only a tenth of that number, and they're found in very small numbers in a certain number of countries, and then their strongholds are generally, say, Kenya, which has just over 2,500, so more than 10%, Tanzania, say Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, maybe Zimbabwe. Not totally sure. I'm not sure what the latest and most reliable data is out of Zimbabwe, and maybe Zambia. And that's pretty much it. The other populations are more fragile. But in South Africa specifically, while there may be 2,500, 3,000 wild lions, there are 3 or 4 times that number in captivity. Or some estimates say between 10 and 12,000. And they are in these captive lion breeding facilities. They're not being bred to return to the wild. Let's be completely clear about that. And recently, the minister responsible in South Africa, Barbara Creecy, has declared that the captive lion breeding industry must come to a close, that there shall be no more cub raising using paying volunteers, which is a big part of the business. There shall be no more walking with lions and exploitation of adolescents in that regard. So that's another part of the business. And there shall be no more captive trophy hunting of lions in an enclosure from which the animal has no chance of escape. Now, that doesn't mean that South Africa won't continue to permit the trophy hunting of truly wild lions in hunting areas. Not something that I am a fan of at all, as you can imagine, but nevertheless, she has taken some very resolute and bold moves to bring this disgraceful industry, which absolutely damages brand South Africa, to an end. What is going to happen to those 10 to 12,000 lions is an extremely difficult question to answer, because if the people who've built these businesses up and who relied on income from 4 different sources, those volunteers who look after the so-called orphan babies, they're not orphaned, they're taken away from the mother at a couple of weeks old. The people who pay money to go and walk for an hour with a lion, it's another source of income. The people who pay for the discounted trophy of a canned lion hunt, takes a couple of days pretending you're on safari when actually it's a done deal. And finally, South Africa, until recently, permitted the export of lion body parts, so not the trophy part, but the body parts, to Southeast Asia for traditional Asian medicine, 800 carcasses a year. All of that adds up to a multi-million-dollar business, tens, if not hundreds of millions of rand. And that's going to come to a close. But as I say, the question is, now what for those 10,000, 12,000 predators, including tigers, by the way, that are kept in these captive breeding facilities? And we've offered to get round the table, not just Born Free, of course, but others who are stakeholders in this, and talk with the minister about what might be possible for some of those animals. But return to the wild isn't going to be an option. So it'll be sanctuaries. It will be staying where they are in hopefully improved circumstances with proper monitoring. But it may also involve the euthanasia of many animals that are sick, unwell, inbred. There is no great outcome for this. The only thing we can do is applaud the minister for her determination and look to a time when this business, this ghastly, grisly business, is over.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of practical questions, like you mentioned, now to go forward. In terms of how these animals being dealt with, but also what are the environments in which they're raised? Because I feel, you can please correct me if I'm wrong here, but the animation that we've now talked about, the example that we're using, paints quite a pretty picture in terms of how the lion is raised, and the environment in which he's in is a very warm and welcoming one. But I imagine you and your parents having experiences of lions which they're not rehabilitatable, not because they're accustomed to people, but rather because they're held in the most cruelest of circumstances. I mean, I know for a fact that a lot of lions have been rescued from hell by the Born Free Foundation, but that has to be accompanied with some experiences that you've had, which you see some of these most horrible environments. I mean, just a way to get people to really understand it. Could you describe some of the situations that you found lions in?
Sure. Well, Judge, firstly, I think just to say that you're absolutely right. I mean, we did not want to paint the story in our animation of a lion kind of living in hell and then being kind of relieved from living in hell by being shot. But actually, many of the facilities that exist in South Africa are, you call them camps. They are literally a tennis court, two tennis court size, row after row of enclosures with lions, multiple lions in them. They may be released from those for a short period of time ahead of being hunted, but only into a larger enclosure to sort of fool the hunter that there is some sense of a wild hunt, that there is some sense of a chase. But there isn't. In terms of the lions that I've been personally involved with, not many from those canned hunting facilities, I have to say, but we've have animals that came from the now defunct Bloemfontein Zoo. I remember one animal that came from two animals that came from the roof of a bar in Tenerife, which is part of Spain, an island. And the guy thought that it would be cool to have lions as an attraction at his bar. And then, of course, they got big and dangerous. And so he put them in a cage that probably measured 4 meters by 3 meters on the roof of his bar. And the reason we got to hear about it, and it's pretty grim, is because local tourists got in touch and said, we hear this terrible noise at night. And it transpired that he would round up stray dogs and feed them to the lions. So we got them out and we put them into a rescue center first in the UK, and then we moved them to South Africa. And our sanctuaries are not the wild. Won't pretend that they are, but each lion or couple of lions, sometimes three if we can put three together, have 2, 3, 4 acres of land. They have the opportunity to retreat from people if they don't want to be at the front edge. We have very, very strictly controlled opportunities for people to see them, usually just from one place. They're always escorted. We always tell the full educational story. We can't release them back into the wild, but we can give them a life worth living. And we can use that opportunity to educate people as to why we shouldn't be having this situation in the first place. There was another lioness that I remember from Italy, and it was one of the very first that we ever rescued. And she was found living in a cage that was 3 meters by 3 meters, so 10 foot by 10 foot. She'd been in there for years, and she'd been there so long that although the cage was probably about 7 foot high, this available space to her was more like about 4 foot in height, because she was living on 3 foot of her own excrement, old plastic bags, and food waste, chicken bones. We got her out, and she looked in really poor condition. And one of the things that we struggle with is whenever we rescue an animal from a really awful situation, we have no knowledge of their prior medical history. No one's been taking them to the vet. No one's had the vet writing up reports. So it's like buying a car from an auction, and it says, bought as seen. You have no real sense of whether anything's working, but you just take a risk. Anyway, we took a risk with her. Her name was Kimber. We brought her to a small little sanctuary that we had at the time in the UK. And we put her into the warm inner house, so all the heated inner house with a straw bed that was raised. And one day she tottered outside. And she literally tottered outside, went over into the sunshine, lay down on a little mound, and lay in the sun for a couple of hours. And that was the only time she ever went outside because she was dead in a few days. And when we did the post-mortem, we found her absolutely riddled with cancer. And people say, well, was it worth all the trouble and the heartache and everything else to rescue this animal and bring her back? And I had that discussion with our consultant vet, John, and he said, let's just give it a go and see what happens, because the thought of us being there, able to rescue her, and then deciding not to do it, and then walking away, was impossible to bear. And even though she only had a month in our care in total, I think it was worth it. And it was worth it in my mind. And I know I'm very anthropomorphic about this, and I really don't care if people criticize me for that. I think if I was in her mind, I'd go, at least I know that there are some people who aren't bad.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, it's terrible to think about the people that built this environment for the lion to be in, that saw this lion more than you will ever see of that lion during the rest of its lifetime. So, for example, this lion was there for years, and you only saw her for 1 month. It's terrible to think about the scenario. There's a micro scenario where these type of people hopefully are held accountable for their actions. At least I know that's what the public definitely would want. I think we'll talk about that shortly. I just want to bring we've seen a lot of focused examples here that you've now mentioned. Just to bring back to the big picture, I once read a disturbing fact. I don't know if you have statistics on this, that there are more lion statues in the world than there are lions left.
Oh, Dan, absolutely, without question. There's probably more lion statues in the United Kingdom than there are lions. The pub called the Red Lion, and then lion brands on this and lion brands on that. We see lions, kind of symbolic lions, everywhere, and they're symbolic of the values and the attributes that we rather like to have for ourselves. Courage and bravery and dignity and power and might and majesty and all of those things. I mean, why are there lions on the royal crest? Because we co-opt those values for ourselves. But even more shocking, I think, than the fact that there are probably more lion statues or symbols in the United Kingdom than there are wild lions. There are more captive tigers in the United States than there are wild tigers in the world. And they are in private facilities, they're on hunting ranches in different parts of the country. Of course, they're also in zoos and roadside menageries and everything else. We are at risk of ending up with a little flavor of the wild world, locked away in one kind of captive facility or another, while we ignore the plight of the wild and we let it slowly disappear through our fingers like sand.
I mean, I love the symbolic nature of the absolute hypocrisy in terms of having these symbols around us of these values that we attribute to a lion, and yet at the same time there's more symbols than there are lions themselves in terms of what we take inspiration from. So thank you for bringing that back. And I think because of this, a lot of people, even if they don't know it, especially I imagine in a country where there's a lot of lion symbolism all around you, they have a very strong connotation to this. So once they and I think this might be the scenario that most people simply just don't know, or they have the problems of their own life, so they just don't care about it right now. But once they do hear the stories, once they do care about it, the couple of people that watch this that really want to make a difference, the question for them remains is, okay, so I can't take all of these captive lions back into the wild. It's not pragmatically possible. Like you said, there's a couple of scenarios where these lions have lived through such horrific circumstances, and you don't know the medical history, that they'll have to be put down in terms of being the most merciful thing to do. There's a question of hopelessness in terms of like, okay, but what can I actually do? And there has to be a message in terms of giving people a directive, giving them a bit of hope, because otherwise it's very easy to fall into despair with this type of thing, I imagine.
Well, it is, but I mean, and I've sort of had to wrestle with that personally for a very long time. I'm heading for my end of my fourth decade doing this. And people do ask the question, don't you just lose hope? I mean, it seems relentlessly one bad news story after another. Um, but it's not, because we can do good things. And, South Africa has many, many people who are determined to both expose the horrors of what's going on. So, the crew who made the film Bloodlines, for example, they were determined to expose the horrors of the canned hunting industry. But there are many people in South Africa and Southern Africa who are determined to try and protect wildlife in its natural habitat. And there are still large areas of natural habitat. I wish there were more, but there are still large areas of natural habitat that can allow species to continue to function as part of evolving ecosystems rather than as sort of living museum pieces in a museum display, in a diorama. But we have to make choices. We have to make decisions as to what we prioritize. And so, for example, and I know that you can see over my shoulder, I've got a magnificent bull elephant. That's in Kenya. And Kenya is the country I'm most familiar with. I've been to Kenya probably 100 times. But the reason I bring that up is because in 1989, there were just 16,400 elephants left in Kenya. That's more than
the entirety of Kenya.
Yeah, now that is more than there were in South Africa, because at the time South Africa capped its elephant population through a culling program, which kept the population in the Kruger, which is the biggest place for elephants, the biggest population of elephants in South Africa, at around 7,500 animals. That was deemed to be not the carrying capacity. Don't get distracted by people who say yes, but that's how many it could hold, because it's holding more than twice that many right now. It was because that's the aesthetic that those who were in charge wanted the park to look like. And they recognized that if there were more elephants than that, then elephants would manage and manipulate that environment and it wouldn't look the way they wanted it to look. Well, I frankly am not interested in what people want an environment to look like. Elephants are mosaic specialists. They live in a patchwork of environments and they manipulate them all. They are the gardeners of the forests of Central Africa, for example. But the reason I mentioned that 16,400, 500 elephants that were in Kenya in 1989 is for two reasons. Firstly, as I mentioned before, Kenya's human population is 5 times what it was in the 1970s, probably 3 times what it was in 1989. And yet today, the number of elephants in Kenya is 36,000. So it's more than doubled at a time of intense human pressure on those environments. So I have to say, well done to the guys on the ground, the Kenya Wildlife Service, the many organizations, Save the Elephants, Big Life Foundation, Born Free, and others who have been working on this. And the second thing is, it's about, as I said, choices. Because I was a witness in a court case in Los Angeles a few years ago. When I say a few years, about 8 years ago. And this was to do with the new elephant house at the Los Angeles Zoo. And that elephant house is 2.4 acres in size. It had 3 elephants, 2 post-reproductive females, and a male who had some severe psychological and physical problems. There was going to be no baby elephants because, as I say, the females were post-reproductive. So I looked at that, and then I looked at what's going on in Kenya, and I realized that the Kenya Wildlife Service and its partners, they protect about 6 million acres of land, not 2.5 acres, 6 million acres of land, and 36,000 elephants, and 1,600 rhino, and 2,500 lions, and leopards, and cheetah, and every other species that lives in those environments. And they do that on a budget of around $45 million US a year. And the elephant house at the LA Zoo cost $42 million for 3 elephants, 2.5 acres, and no vision. And I think that's where we make our choices. We decide, do I patronize this institution and their agenda, or do I say, no, I want to be part of a different narrative, and I want to help protect species in the wild, whether that's lions in South Africa, elephants in South Africa, elephants in Kenya, bonobos in the Democratic Republic of Congo, eastern lowland gorillas plummeting towards extinction as we speak, chimpanzees, western lowland gorillas, mountain gorillas. Do you know what? There's plenty that we can do and plenty that we can be positive about, but sitting on our hands and doing nothing is not an option.
I think that's an incredibly strong message for anybody out there. And I mean, I think that's actually so inspiring. We had this discussion on the channel the other day where I said that, we talked to a wide variety of people here. I'm not going to hijack the interview for that, of course, but, we talked to a wide variety of people here, politicians to economists to, nature conservationists. And nature conservationists somehow have one of the most daunting prospects in front of them in terms of, where the future of wildlife is going, and yet are some of the most optimistic and, happiest people in terms of the world that they're helping to shape. So in this case, I think, it's worth getting passionate about that as well. I just want to talk also about another video that I saw recently about the conservation area between Botswana, near the panhandle of Caprivi. So near Botswana, Namibia, Angola, and I think it's Zambia up there, I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah.
And
The Kaza region.
exactly, yeah, and the Kavango Basin and so on. And this is an environment which is, my family, I've had the fortune of visiting it, is absolutely stunningly beautiful in the way that it's preserved. And this conservation area allows a lot of natural ecosystems and habitats to continue to exist. And the video that I saw was about a Canadian oil company doing test well sites, digging within this conservation area. I was like, what the hell? How is this even possible? Yeah. So in terms of, not even going out and seeing this or being physically a part of it, in the way that we lobby and allow, regulations to be passed and license to be given to companies to try and, manipulate this environment, that's a thing we can also do something about in the decisions that you've made, like you've mentioned.
It is. I mean, it comes back often to individual purchasing power. What do we do with the rand or the pound or the euro or the dollar in our pocket, and what do we spend it on? We can choose to buy recycled products. We can choose to buy low impact products. We can choose to buy products that haven't got a huge carbon footprint because they've been flown halfway around the world for us to be able to consume out of season. They would never grow in our country, but out of season. There are so many things that we can do. It requires a tiny bit of extra work because you actually have to do a little bit of research to find out, what's true and what is just spin. But once you've done that and had a good look at it, I think you can craft your own sort of life experience in a way that is, less impactful on the planet, more sustainable, better for communities who may be reliant on your expenditure in one way or another, and not the huge multinationals for whom you are just a tiny little statistic in a huge big box. Yeah. So I think it is down to us, and I have to say I'm becoming increasingly disillusioned with our elected representatives because I still don't think they get it. It's sort of business as usual, but with a little bit of spin. And I think that it is now time for us as individuals to make our voices heard, number one, and secondly, to make our expenditure, what the money that we spend, do the talking for us.
Yeah, and I know, for example, that you're vegan and you live this lifestyle as a message and an embodiment of what you've just mentioned in terms of making the choices to make sure that this is sustainable. I was vegetarian myself for a couple of years. I'm not anymore now, and because of this, I would just like to lastly ask the question: there are a lot of good people that I know in South Africa that enjoy not trophy hunting, but hunting for meat, hunting for sustenance, and looking at these type of environments in a way that's actually sustainable, not only from wild hunting, but also purchasing meat and animal products on the market. Do you feel that there is a balance between this? Because I know there's a very strong argument to be made that there's no balance to be had and that, going meat free is the only way forward. But then because of this, there's a polarizing effect where people then go, no, I'm going to go trophy hunt to kind of show you wrong, I can take what I want. Is there a way in which we can balance this to end off of? Or is there a way in which, we really have to progress to a fully, animal free usage of products that we use every day?
It's a very interesting question, and honestly, there will be the polar ends of that spectrum who will never agree to compromise or to find a way forward. They will be absolutist in their view, either pro-use in every form or anti-use in every form, and they're entitled to that view. I think the challenge is for the middle ground, which makes up probably 90% of us, who for whom it is nuanced in some respects. So there are effectively three types, maybe four, three types of hunting. There's trophy hunting. I have no time for trophy hunting. I feel that it's a colonial relic pastime. It's not practiced by African societies. You know, there are forms of cultural hunting in African societies. The Maasai used to kill lions as a rites of passage. But the idea of going off and killing a magnificent animal for fun is not part of Africa's psyche. Then there is subsistence hunting, as you describe. And if I was a person for whom the difference between survival and not survival was hunting an animal to feed my family or my extended family, who am I to argue against that if there is no alternative? So that speaks to a whole range of different issues, including the massive inequities that exist. You know, I was looking this up the other day, and I'm not picking on anyone in particular, but I think it's about 16% of the population of Namibia live in poverty, in real poverty. This is the dollar a day type poverty. And yet there are over $3,000 millionaires living in Namibia. Dollar millionaires. And this is out of a human population of only 2.5 million people. That seems like a pretty high percentage to me. And my question, that for me, that raises the question of inequity. The distribution of opportunity, choice, resources, including money, is a massive challenge in many societies. The UK is not any different from others. But until we get to grips with that, and while we not just tolerate but celebrate individuals who are willing to spend, you know, $1 million on a 40-minute space travel flight for a bit of fun, while the world is in the mess that it's in, and they have the ability to make a massive difference, but choose not to do it, then I think we have some serious problems. When you have huge corporations who have set up their tax affairs in such a way as that they pay no tax, there is something profoundly and utterly wrong with that. While the levels of corruption that exist in all countries, and there's not a single country I can think of that doesn't suffer from, but while that corruption persists and is allowed to persist and has networks that continue to allow it to exist, we are in serious trouble. So I can't rely on our elected leaders or our business leaders to solve this. I have to rely on us. And I'm very, very tired of the expression, when are they going to do something about it? Because it's no longer right. It's what are we going to do about it? And I want to replace the they with us and we rather than them.
Oh, I think that's important as well. I mean, it motivates the absolute, you know, democratic power, but also the purchasing power and decision-making power of our democratic society. Because frankly, in a lot of these scenarios, we are democratic societies. Thank goodness for that. At least we should start to, you know, actually exercise said power for once in our life. So thank you so much for sharing that message. I just want to give you a last chance. Is there anything else you wanted to add or plug or something before we end off the interview?
Well, you asked, you know, and what can people do? There probably are three things that people can do. The first is, don't stay silent. If you care about this issue, find out more, do some research, go on the internet, talk to friends, talk to family, talk to work colleagues, try and build up that sense of common purpose, because if we can all gather around a sense of common purpose, then an awful lot can be done. The second thing is to use that individual purchasing power to make informed choices about you and your footprint in the world. And the third thing is, if you are fortunate enough to have some spare resources, then find an organization. I will say Born Free, but it doesn't have to be us. It could be an organization that you've looked at and you've researched and that you trust and that you feel is accountable. And if they're doing things that chime with your sense of values, whether that's wildlife or refugees or women's empowerment or education or healthcare, then lend your support to that organization. We are an incredibly powerful species. The human species has the capacity to do terribly bad things, unbelievably bad things, and we all can think of evidence of that. Goodness me, what's going on in Afghanistan right now. But we also have the capacity to do incredibly good things. And what we need to do is to move the dial towards doing good things and move it away from bad stuff. And if people do bad stuff, they need to be stopped. And if they do good things, they need to be applauded. And I think that those would be the little take-home messages I would offer.
Definitely, and I agree with that. And I mean, anybody that made it this far, please, by all means, if you don't agree with what World here said, just breaching that perspective or starting that conversation can sometimes be the stepping stones towards making that change happen. And maybe the change isn't exactly the way that we think it is. Maybe there's a better change in terms of the future. But starting that conversation is where we're getting to the point of which we can actually resolve these issues. So thank you so much.
I tell you, Petrus, I was always amazingly impressed by Arnold Schwarzenegger. For many reasons, but not least because he said, listen, we have to change the way we do stuff. So would you just try having a vegetarian meal once a week? Is it too much to ask? And he's progressively moved to a more sustainable way of living. And he's a rather, I think, honest and admirable person for speaking his mind about things that trouble him, even if the people doing the things that trouble him happen to be of his similar political persuasion. He's not afraid of anybody. And I think we've got to not be afraid. Just try something once. And if you feel good, do it again.
It's actually the best power is just to try it. Just try it. I mean, there really is nothing to lose in just trying it once. And at the very least, if you've tried it once, then if you make an argument for or against the situation in the future, at the very least, you can talk from experience instead of talking from secondhand stuff. So thank you so much to Will for sharing this message. I really appreciate it. Well, definitely, of course, put the links in the description to Born Free. And, we recommend people to go and watch that. And also just watch the YouTube channel. There's so many messages there, so many videos there that are just, quite heartwarming. If you need to pick me up, go and watch those. It makes you feel good that there's some good people left in this world. So thank you so much to Will. Thank you so much to our viewers. Really appreciate it. Stay well, and thanks for watching. This has been WorldView.